Students, this is the 50-cent tour of the Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Recovery course. I'm the instructor, Karen Clements. Jenna Dare and Betty Wedgwood are the field instructors, and we have the very good fortune to have a course consultant working with us, Lisa Walter. Other parts of the team that aren't mentioned here are the programs that you go to in your shadow day, as well as the agency preceptor who will help connect you with the very important person to you in this course, the recovery preceptor. We've very deliberately used the word preceptor for the person with whom you will discuss their recovery journey because they're teachers to you, resources to you. You're all familiar with Moodle, so I don't need to go into details on how to make it work. You've done a great job signing up for your program Shadow Day, and by now you will have gotten assigned to a recovery or an agency preceptor in order to get in touch with your recovery preceptor. Let's take a look at the syllabus as a way of talking about the course. Let's get it to be a nice size. This course is based on the recovery paradigm or recovery philosophy. Recovery was once called a model and a movement. We talk about recovery-oriented services. Recovery is reaching the threshold of being called a philosophy. There are beliefs and knowledge base associated with philosophy that I very much identify with. And I think probably it's the primary philosophy that I work out of. So I've picked 3 principles from the recovery philosophy. There are more than 3. You will, if you don't know now, you'll know by the end of this course. And one of them is empowerment, because recovery is fundamentally about shifting the relations of power in mental health more towards an equal power sharing relationship. So the course is designed to try to actualize more equality within the relationships between the psychiatric nurse, the client, the student, the faculty. Okay? Students, you are encouraged throughout the course to think critically about relations of power. The second principle that is indispensable in recovery philosophy is the value of lived experience. It is fundamentally about recognizing, privileging lived experience knowledge, such that lived experience knowledge, mental health service users' knowledge, is essential to mental health services and helping relationships. And so there's a lot of work now about privileging that knowledge. And we are trying to reflect that in the course. A third essential component we're going to aspire to is collaborative relationships. Recovery is relationship. This was mentioned to me by Chris Somerville. And psychiatric nurses within a recovery model engage in collaborative relationships with mental health service users in order to assist them in their recovery of a quality of life as they define that. And so we are going to try to work together. The members of the team that get called faculty and the members of the team that get called students, we all have something to add to this course. We all have knowledge to add to this course. Also, part of the course is aimed at teaching you some tips and tricks and practicing how to do recovery plans that are collaborative. Now, I'm basing this course on a pedagogical model. So this course is built on philosophical principles and on pedagogical principles. And this is where I'm really super lucky to have Lisa Walter as a mentor for me. So Lisa has worked in union education for 10 years, and that the model that's used or was used in her education was popular education pedagogy, which comes from Paulo Freire. His famous book was Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Interesting fellow, interesting perspective. It is solidly in line with empowerment. It is definitely attuned to the value of lived experience and principles of collaboration. So I've taught for many years, and I aspire to collaborative student-centered teaching and critical pedagogy. But how do I do it? How do I get out of my old habit of doing things the same way? Well, Lisa introduced me to this spiral model of popular education. It can be drawn in different ways, but the basic principle is that you start with experience. We start with your experience, you start with your client's experience, you start with your recovery preceptor's experience. This means that as a nurse, first of all, you ask about and you listen to the person tell you about their experiences. You could call that a narrative. You could call it a story. But what's important is that people have an opportunity. They feel welcomed to tell you the difficulties that they're going through and how they see that. And out of looking at experience, we can, in the classroom, look together on patterns of what we already know and therefore what new information is needed. Some of that new information you will gather. Some of that new information I will give you a lecture about or point to materials, because there's things I know from my practice, from knowing about the licensing exams. I know there are certain things you need to know for practice. So part of my job is to introduce you to those things. With the client, it means that you are identifying, you could call patterns assessment. You're looking for patterns in the information that you have. As a nurse, you're adding new information that you think may be useful to the person, and you're setting goals about what you need to do to move forward. We will take this assessment of what we know and what we need to know, bringing in the new information from your research, from what we have to add. And you will practice some of that in the classroom through group scenarios. You'll practice that as you speak to your recovery preceptors, as you do your papers, as you do your ideal program, as you meet the evaluation requirements of the program. And with that, there is an expectation that that will change you and change your practice. So what is each day going to look like when I'm using this new crazy model, which is new to me? So I'm relying on your feedback on what's working, how we can do it better. Lisa and I have made a structure for the classes, and not every class will follow this structure, but we'll start with an experiential exercise to get you in touch experientially with some aspect of the topic for the day. And then there'll be time to talk about that experience. We'll spend about 45 minutes of each class doing group work based on the research that you students bring to the topic, and also time for role playing in order to work on practicing what you learn about how to do collaborative recovery planning. So this 45 minutes might sometimes be mostly on content related to the topic, and sometimes more time would be spent on you working in groups, actually practicing what you've learned from the Tandora book about collaborative recovery planning. And it's through this project work, group work on collaborative recovery planning that you as a group will build one of the assignments, which is a collaborative recovery plan. I will spend, maybe 60 minutes giving you some theory about the topic, and then we will end the class. Each class, we will start with this part of the spiral. You'll work in small groups and then large groups to identify what you already know about the topic for next week, where the gaps are, and together as a class, plan about what information do I need. I'll be expecting students to bring some research and learning back to the class. All right, so, we'll see how that goes. The Tandora book, you will definitely need to read that before the classes. The Corrigan book is a reference book for you so that when you're doing research, particularly around psychiatric rehabilitation, you have a good resource that is you can count on to find reliable information. But there are articles that you might search. There might be reliable websites that you can search. We have the course objectives, and I'll keep them posted up in the classroom because I've tried to design the course so that we check off all those course objectives. I don't have any power over changing those. Now, I'm going to go here to course at a glance before we go to course evaluation. So we have the topics. At the end of the class, we will look at what you already know about the principles of recovery in practice, because you already know quite a bit, and we'll identify what new learning is necessary so that you can do some research between the 6th of September and the 14th of September and bring that to the class. Lisa Walter will lead you in a discussion on a critique of hope. I'll do some lecturing on person-centered care planning, and you'll have scenarios so that you can work in your group on one section of collaborative planning. This is what you expect to see out of one of my course at a glances. You can see when things are due. You can see what you're supposed to read. You can see that we have guest speakers on November 29th. Members of the clubhouse will be coming to, I got the wrong, I'm pointing at the wrong date. Members of the clubhouse will be coming, October 4th. October 4th, members of the clubhouse will be coming to work with you in small groups as your teachers, as your preceptors. And the last day, we'll have you giving me some evaluation on the course. I'd like a bit more detailed evaluation than the BU standard evaluation because I want to know what's working and what's not working. We also have student evaluation slotted in earlier in the course. Looks like I just didn't write it in here. We'll talk about mental health activism. Lisa has some really interesting perspectives to give you, and I have been working with Deborah Dusholm and Dana Naismith and others on research on Manitoba mental health activists, and we'll report on that and we'll have a party. All right, how are you going to be evaluated? There's a theory portion and a practicum portion. You've got to get 60% on the theory component, and you have to get 60% on the practicum component, and you add those two together to give you the mark for the course. So you can't fail one and pass the other. You have to pass both of these. Now you see how much each assignment is worth and when they are due. The program visit day is technically part of the practicum component, but you'll see that the evaluation of that day is done within the theory component. I'll explain that in a minute. So the practicum evaluation is done through your recovery narrative, the bulk of the mark, and also a critical reflection narrative, or a critical reflection on the recovery narrative. So let's talk about that. You'll see on Moodle that you have places to hand in your assignments, not the ideal program assignment, but the other assignments. And you have marking guides. So you will go on a program shadow day, and based on that program shadow day, you will write a paper. The explanation, the requirements of that paper are in the syllabus. Here is the marking guide that we'll use to mark that critical reflection paper. There will also be an ideal program, and I'll describe what that means. That you'll do as a group. Your program shadow day critical reflection paper is one person writes their own paper. The ideal program is done in a group, and here is how we will be marking your ideal program presentation. You will be doing a group collaborative recovery plan, and that also has a grading guide, which I have derived from the textbook and just kind of tweaked it to suit our needs. So you know exactly how you're going to be marked. There is also a marking guide for the recovery narrative itself. Well, I don't know how that got in there. I will fix. And, very interesting, and there's a marking guide for the recovery critical reflection paper. So you individually do a narrative, recovery narrative, You individually do a recovery narrative critical reflection. All right, let's go back to the syllabus. I will let you read about the objectives for the recovery narrative that will help you to understand what's expected out of that recovery narrative. There's clear expectations for what you have to do in that recovery narrative practicum. They are 2 products you will produce that will be marked regarding the recovery narrative. I'm giving you more guidelines about the recovery narrative. It's a collaborative, creative piece of work. So the characteristics of the recovery narrative will be determined by the recovery preceptor, like whether they want to use their real name or their pseudonym. Do they want to use first person or third person? And what form the actual recovery is going to take. Keep in mind, this is the preceptor's narrative. So use your psych nursing skills: listening, polite curiosity, encouragement, and respect for person-driven outcomes. These are core psychiatric nursing skills. The recovery preceptor has to read that narrative at least once, and we encourage students to consult with the recovery preceptor as you go along designing the recovery narrative. The recovery preceptor gets a copy of the completed narrative, and you give me a copy of the recovery narrative because that's what I'm going to mark. You'll see when I put up the correct marking guide that the narrative will be evaluated on its organization, on its cohesion, on its clarity, appropriate voice and tone, and on your creativity. The preceptor, recovery preceptor, and the agency preceptors will not review or be given a copy of your recovery narrative reflection paper. The recovery preceptor will evaluate their experience with you. So this is to be completed by the recovery preceptor. So this is something that we'll take into account when marking your recovery narrative. Certainly can indicate if there was problems with respect, for instance, or the person didn't feel heard. Here's an idea of what to do for this reflection paper. It is your chance to show me what you've learned in the course. Pick one thing, several salient topics, or one salient topic from the recovery preceptor's narrative to critically examine what you've learned in the course. So you're going to talk about material from the course, from your research, from the textbooks. So it might be one or several of these, as is appropriately found in your recovery narrative, the person's recovery narrative. It's only 3 pages. So you really have to be tight. I'm really looking for you to show your chops, what you've learned, And your writing skills, you're going to use APA, but now you're going to apply it to something more personal, right? You were involved in the co-production of this narrative. It's also what's called ideographic work. The work pertains to a particular person. So this gives you the opportunity to consider the experience of a particular person in relation to collective knowledge about recovery and psychiatric rehabilitation. Here are instructions about the paper you're going to write, the critical reflection paper you're going to write on your program shadow day. Here are the instructions about what is expected from your ideal program group project presentation, and we have some examples in the classroom for you. The grading scheme is nothing new to you. Please let me emphasize about accessibility and accommodation. You have University of Winnipeg services available to you. They will be coordinated through Brandon University accessibility services, but you don't have to go to Brandon or speak directly to someone in Brandon about that. You can use the Winnipeg resources. Now, it's important that it's the beginning of the class where you go to accessibility services if you believe that some type of accommodation will be useful to you. And they will work at identifying those accommodations and then sending a letter to me as the course instructor. It's important that I know ways that will help you and support you in the course. Like you and I have a relationship. And if you're likely to have difficulties, you don't have to tell me what your difficulties are. But to be truly helpful to you, I need to talk with you about it at the beginning of the course. So I'm not blindsided later, and also I can be more compassionate in helping you with accommodations. So identify early with University of Winnipeg and come and talk to me about it. Again, you don't have to tell me the nature of your difficulty, but what kind of accommodations you need and how I can be helpful in that. Now there's forms. Your agency preceptor, the person who works at the agency and hooks you up with your recovery preceptor, will fill out this evaluation form. And you can see that for the most part, it has to do with our processes, how well we're doing our process. It also has to do with whether the agency person perceives you as having met your obligations. The recovery preceptor is asked to give us feedback, and they may get some help on this from the agency preceptor. So they are asked some questions and able to write in extra things. The recovery narrative release form, Jen will have talked with you about this at our first class. That narrative that you write for the person is confidential. You'll see it. The marker, myself or Jen, will see it. And the recovery preceptor, the person themselves, will see it. This release form is in case the person you've interviewed for 7 weeks or so, would like to have it kept in the agency file. their file at the agency. They have to release and say that that's allowable. They also could choose to have it available and saved so that I would strip out the identifiers and I could show students in other years an example of a recovery narrative. So they don't have to tick off both of those or any of them. They can just tick off that it'll be destroyed. They keep their copy. All other copies are destroyed. So you need to do this with your client, your recovery preceptor. I'm sorry, I haven't been very clear. This part is what you have to also agree, and the preceptor has to also agree. I should do a little more planning ahead of time. So you have to agree if it's going to be kept and not destroyed, and the recovery preceptor has to consent if it's going to be kept, or they can state it's going to be destroyed. Well, I hope that's clear instead of making things more confusing. The role of the preceptor is there because it's something we send out to them. I've added considerable resources that you can draw on in your research to meet the weekly learning objectives. There are also additional resources on the website, and I may add more. And there are resources for each week. And this is this was a research project done on the Recovery Narrative Project in this program. And it was sponsored by the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And subsequent to that research project, the Mental Health Commission of Canada states that this narrative recovery project should be used by all training programs for mental health workers. So you'll see that for each week, there are resources that you can rely on. These are not required readings. The required readings are out of the textbook, Tandora. Yeah, there we are. Please read. These are resources that will help you with the identified learning needs. And I'll probably be adding them as I go along. What I'm showing you is my instructor editing turned on Vision. So if I turn off editing and I go to, sometimes they put switch rule, move things in different places. Student, you can see it looks a little bit differently. Now, this is the day that will be put aside. The whole day will be put aside for your groups to present your ideal program presentations. All right. Coming back to the textbooks, there's been a huge problem with the Brandon University bookstore, and there are many classes where the books were not, they were ordered, but they were never, you didn't ever get the books. So that is true for Tandora, and also the Psych Rehab book. They are available by on Amazon.com. They're available as digital books. They're more expensive as digital books. What is that all about? So the hard copies are on order. Thank you, Emily, for being so on top of that. And just to let you know, most people don't have their books, most courses. So I haven't put it up yet. Did I put it up? Yes, I did. Partnering for Recovery in Mental Health is a PDF document of the first 3 chapters that you have to read for week 2, so that there should be time for you to get the textbooks for the rest of the course. You've got the first 3 chapters, okay? That's available for everybody. I can't put up any more chapters because it's illegal for me to put up more, to copy and distribute more than 10% of the book. I think I've talked about everything. I certainly talked long enough. So, happy to work with you. Send me an email. You got questions? Thanks.